There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. A Tuesday evening with the rain tapping a restless rhythm against the window pane. The low hum of the refrigerator filling the space between heartbeats. They were the camouflage of routine, of comfortable silence and shared space, and you don't realize their true nature until much later. You don't understand that you are standing on a threshold, that the architecture of your entire world is being redrawn around you by a single, whispered phrase, a subtle shift in weight, the sudden, terrifying absence of distance. These are the moments that develop slowly in the darkroom of memory, the image emerging from the chemical bath of time, revealing a truth that was always there, waiting for the right light to be seen. For me, that moment smelled like damp wool, tasted faintly of the cheap beer we'd been drinking, and was defined by the solid, unyielding warmth of Julian's body pressed against mine on a couch that was suddenly, impossibly, too small for the both of us. It began, as these things so often did between us, with an accusation wrapped in affection. He had been recounting a story about one of our teammates, a dramatic retelling of a minor practice mishap involving a misplaced kickboard and a fountain of chlorinated water. My own version of the event, the one I had witnessed from 2 lanes over, was far more mundane, but Julian had a way of finding the grand opera in the everyday. He gestured wildly, his hands carving arcs in the dim lamplight, his voice rising and falling with theatrical despair. I had laughed, a low sound in my chest, and said something about his flair for embellishment. He stopped mid-gesture, turned his head on the worn cushion, and pinned me with a look that was half amused, half genuinely offended. "Me," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "Leo, you make everything dramatic. You live in a state of quiet, perpetual drama. I just give it a voice." I remember thinking how wrong he was, and yet how right. My drama was internal, a silent, churning sea beneath a placid surface, while his was a crashing wave, all noise and spray and spectacle. We were 2 different kinds of weather occupying the same small space. He had then settled back into the cushions, the energy of his story dissipating, leaving behind that familiar, comfortable quiet that was the bedrock of our friendship. We lay there for a long time, side by side, the length of his body a familiar landmark next to mine. The television mumbled on, unwatched, casting flickering blue and gold light across his face. I was acutely aware of the scant inch of air between my arm and his, a space that felt charged with a strange and volatile energy, a border I was terrified to cross. It was a proximity I had grown accustomed to, yet never comfortable with, a kind of sweet torment I endured in exchange for the simple, profound peace of his presence. Eventually, my leg began to cramp. I shifted, a small, involuntary movement, an attempt to find relief without disturbing the delicate equilibrium of the room. It was nothing, a twitch, a slight realignment of my limbs on the worn fabric of the sofa. But his reaction was instantaneous and absolute. His hand, which had been resting on his stomach, shot out and landed on my hip, not with force, but with a surprising, anchoring weight. The warmth of his palms soaked through my jeans, a sudden point of focus in the hazy comfort of the evening. His voice, when it came, was a low whisper, barely more than a breath against the ambient noise of the rain and the television. "Don't move," and just like that, the ordinary Tuesday evening shattered. The disguise fell away, and I saw the threshold I was standing on. His words were not a request. They were a plea, soft and raw and holding a universe of meaning I was too terrified to decipher. The casual, teasing friend was gone, replaced by someone else, someone whose need was a tangible presence in the room. The inch of air between us had been breached, not by me, but by him, and in its place was the solid, undeniable pressure of his hand. My entire body went still, my breath caught in my throat. The quiet between us was no longer comfortable. It was a vast, echoing chamber filled with the frantic, silent screaming of my own heart, a heart that had been whispering his name in the dark for years. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was pinned by the weight of his hand, by the gravity of his words, by the sudden, terrifying hope that this was not, in fact, an ordinary evening at all. I was a photographer, a quiet observer by trade and by nature, and for the first time in my life, I felt as though the lens had been turned back on me, capturing me in a moment of utter, helpless transparency. Our friendship had been built in the sterile, echoing natatorium, a place that smelled perpetually of chlorine and damp towels. Julian was a force of nature in the water, a study in explosive power and fluid grace. He moved like he owned the lane, his strokes carving deep, powerful trenches in the water, leaving a wake that rocked the lane lines. On the pool deck, he was the same, loud, bright, a sun that everyone else seemed to orbit. He collected friends with the same ease that he collected medals, drawing people into his light with an effortless charisma. I was not like that. I was a distance swimmer, my craft built on endurance, on rhythm, on the quiet solitude of staring at a black line for hours on end. My movements were efficient, not explosive. On the deck, I was a satellite to his sun, content to exist in his outer orbit, observing, listening, documenting the world through the lens of my camera, which was almost always with me. I was the team's unofficial photographer, a role I'd fallen into because I preferred the quiet space behind the viewfinder to the boisterous chaos of the group. We became friends not through a single event, but through a slow accumulation of shared moments in the quiet hours. We were the first ones at morning practice and the last ones to leave in the afternoon. We found a shared rhythm in the discipline, in the grueling work that no one else saw. We would sit on the cold tile of the bleachers after a long set, exhausted and steaming in the cool air, not needing to speak. I learned the language of his silences, the frustrated quiet after a bad time trial, the bone-deep, peaceful quiet after a workout that had pushed him to his absolute limit. He, in turn, seemed to understand mine. He never pushed me to be more talkative, never teased me for my quiet nature in the way others sometimes did. He simply made space for it. For me, treating my silence not as an absence, but as a presence, something as valid and real as his own laughter. He would just sit with me, our shoulders occasionally brushing, and watch the water settle in the empty pool, the surface slowly returning to a perfect, glassy calm. My feelings for him grew in that same way, gradually, quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. It wasn't a lightning strike. It was more like the slow, methodical process of developing a photograph. At first, there was just a blankness, the simple fact of our friendship. Then, slowly, an image began to emerge in the faint red light of my own private thoughts. It was the way the water beaded on his shoulders when he hoisted himself out of the pool, the muscles in his back pulling taut. It was the unrestrained, joyful sound of his laugh, a sound that could fill an entire room. It was the unexpected moments of thoughtfulness, like the time he brought me a coffee before a morning final, remembering exactly how I took it, a small detail I was sure he'd long forgotten. Each observation was another moment in the chemical bath, sharpening the lines, deepening the shadows, until the image was undeniable, fully formed, and hanging in the darkroom of my heart. I was in love with him. And it was a hopeless, silent, and deeply treasured secret. I guarded it like a fragile, priceless negative. I built walls around it, emotional bulkheads designed to contain the feeling and keep it from spilling out and ruining the most important friendship I had ever known. Julian was a constant, steady presence in my life, but he was also a revolving door of girlfriends. They were always bright, lovely women who seemed to match his energy, and he was, by all accounts, a wonderful boyfriend. I learned their names, made polite conversation at team parties, and quietly photographed their happy, smiling faces, capturing their joy while my own heart felt like a sealed, lightless room. Each new relationship was a fresh layer of brick on the walls I'd built, a painful but necessary reinforcement. He was my best friend. That was the foundation of our world, the single truth upon which everything else rested. To confess my feelings would be to take a sledgehammer to that foundation, risking the collapse of the entire structure just for the selfish, impossible hope that he might feel the same. So I remained the quiet observer, the keeper of secrets, the friend. It was a role I had accepted, a pain I had learned to manage. It was enough. It had to be. The shift began on a rainy Thursday in October. It was the kind of relentless, soul-dampening rain that turns the sky into a low, gray ceiling and the world into a series of muted watercolors. I was in my small apartment off campus, editing a set of photos from our last swim meet, trying to coax the vibrant blue of the water and the gold of our team caps out of the flat, digital files. My world was silent except for the click of my mouse and the steady drumming of the rain against the glass. Then my phone buzzed, a harsh, intrusive sound. It was Julian. The text was simple, unadorned with his usual barrage of emojis. "Can I come over?" It was unusual. He rarely asked. He usually just showed up, announcing his arrival with a series of loud, rapid-fire knocks that always sounded more urgent than they were. The formality of the question felt like a warning siren. I typed back a simple "of course" and waited. The 20 minutes it took for him to get from his dorm to my place felt like an eternity. I found myself pacing the length of my small living room, my stomach twisting into a tight, anxious knot. When he finally arrived, his knocking was subdued, a soft, hesitant tapping that I almost didn't hear over the storm. I opened the door to a version of Julian I had never seen before. He was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, his jacket dripping onto my welcome mat. But it was his face that stopped me cold. The usual light in his eyes was gone, extinguished, leaving behind a hollow, defeated look. His shoulders were slumped, his entire posture a portrait of collapse. He looked smaller, somehow, as if the rain had washed away his usual vibrant energy and left him diminished. "Sarah and I broke up," he said, his voice flat and empty. The words just hung there in the doorway, caught between the warmth of my apartment and the cold, wet night. I didn't know what to do. I was so accustomed to Julian the sun, Julian the unshakable force, that Julian the broken was a foreign country for which I had no map. I stepped aside and pulled him into the apartment, closing the door on the storm. I took his wet jacket and hung it on the back of a chair to dry. I made him a cup of tea, my hands moving on autopilot, the familiar ritual a comfort in the face of his unfamiliar grief. He sank onto my couch, the one that would later become the stage for our quiet drama, and stared blankly at the opposite wall, his hands wrapped around the warm mug but not drinking from it. He didn't cry. He just sat there, hollowed out, and started to talk. He spoke in a low monotone, recounting the conversation, the final, painful words, the quiet closing of a door on 2 years of his life. It wasn't a dramatic retelling. There was no embellishment, no grand gestures. It was just a flat, stark recitation of facts, which was more heartbreaking than any performance could ever have been. I listened. That was all I could do. I sat on the armchair across from him, my own tea growing cold, and I just listened. I didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. The architecture of his world had just been demolished, and telling him he could rebuild wouldn't fix the rubble at his feet. I just provided a quiet space for his pain to exist, to be seen and heard without judgment. My own complicated feelings, a guilty, shameful flicker of hope buried under a mountain of genuine sympathy for my friend's suffering. I pushed down, locked away. This moment wasn't about me. It was about him. He talked for hours, the story circling back on itself, picking apart moments, searching for a reason, a sign he had missed. As the night deepened, his words slowed, the energy finally draining out of him, until he fell into an exhausted silence. The rain had softened to a gentle patter. He looked utterly spent, a ship run aground after a violent storm. "I don't want to go back to my room," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The room we had shared as freshmen, the one he now had to himself, was filled with 2 years of her memory, a museum of a life that was now over. "You can stay here," I said, the words coming out before I'd even had a chance to think about them. "Take the bed. I'll take the couch." He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time all night. His eyes were red-rimmed and lost. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Okay," he breathed. And with that single word, a new boundary was drawn, or rather, an old one was erased. He had always been a guest in my space. That night, for the first time, he was seeking refuge. I didn't know it then, but the foundation of our friendship had developed a hairline fracture, and something new, something fragile and terrifying, was beginning to seep through the cracks. That first night established the new pattern. He took my bed, and I took the couch. I lay awake for most of the night, listening to the sound of his breathing from the other room, a slow, steady rhythm that was both a comfort and a quiet agony. The thought of him, grieving and alone in my bed, was a physical ache in my chest. I wanted to go to him, to offer some kind of physical comfort, a hand on his shoulder, anything. But I didn't. The walls I had so carefully constructed were still in place, and the fear of being misunderstood, of my comfort being misinterpreted as something predatory or selfish, was a powerful deterrent. So I stayed on the couch, a lonely sentinel guarding a house of unspoken things. He stayed for 3 days. He went to classes and practice on autopilot, a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. In the evenings, he would return to my apartment, and we would fall into our new routine. We'd eat takeout in near silence, watch movies he didn't seem to see, and I would listen if he needed to talk, which he did, in sporadic, painful bursts. I became the curator of his grief, the quiet archivist of his heartbreak. On the third night, as I was getting blankets for the couch, he stopped me. He was standing in the doorway of my bedroom, a silhouette against the dim light from the hall. "This is stupid," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "It's your bed. I can take the couch. It's fine, Julian," I insisted. "I don't mind, no," he said, and there was a new kind of finality in his tone. He ran a hand through his already messy hair. "It's a big bed. We both fit." He said it so casually, as if he were commenting on the weather, but the words landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. It was a logical, practical solution. My bed was a queen, more than enough space for 2 people who had spent countless hours crammed onto tiny hotel beds during away meets. There was nothing inherently intimate about it, but for me, the suggestion was a tectonic shift. It felt like he was inviting me into the very center of his vulnerability, and at the same time, unknowingly asking me to step into the heart of my own secret, dangerous territory. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. 1,000 excuses, 1,000 reasons to say no, flew through my mind. It was too much. It was too close. It was a line I had promised myself I would never, ever cross. But one look at his face, at the profound, bone-deep weariness etched into his features, silenced all of them. He looked like he couldn't bear the thought of being alone, not even in the next room. His need for simple, uncomplicated human presence outweighed my fear. So I found myself nodding, my voice a strained whisper when I finally managed to speak. "Okay." That night, I learned the geography of sleeping next to Julian. I lay ramrod straight on my side of the bed, my back to him, occupying the absolute minimum amount of space possible. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear every soft breath he took. The space between us felt vast and infinitesimal at the same time, a chasm filled with unspoken tension. I was a cartographer mapping a dangerous new land, acutely aware of every mountain and valley of the blankets, every subtle shift in the mattress. I barely slept, my mind racing, my body rigid with the effort of feigning casualness. But Julian, in his exhaustion, fell asleep almost instantly, and at some point, deep in the night, he must have turned over, because I woke in the pre-dawn grayness to find his arm thrown across my waist, his face buried in my back, his breath warm against my shoulder blades. My entire being froze. It was the unconscious, unthinking intimacy of someone seeking warmth and comfort in the dark. It meant nothing. It meant everything. I lay there, trapped by his sleeping weight and my own wild, hopeful, terrified heart, and I didn't move until the sun came up. This became the ritual. He never went back to his own dorm room for more than a few hours at a time, just long enough to grab fresh clothes and textbooks. My apartment became his base, his sanctuary, and every night, we would end up in my bed. The initial stiffness and my hyper-awareness slowly, gradually, began to fade, eroded by the sheer force of routine. It was impossible to maintain that level of high alert night after night. My body, against my will, began to relax into his presence. The accidental, sleep-heavy touches became more frequent. A leg thrown over mine, a hand brushing my arm. He was a tactile sleeper, a seeker of warmth, and I was the closest source. I told myself it was platonic, a side effect of his grief and exhaustion. He needed an anchor in the storm of his emotions, and I had become it. I was just a warm body, a steady presence in the dark. I repeated this mantra to myself every night as I fell asleep to the sound of his breathing, and every morning when I woke up with his arm draped over me. The couch, however, became a different kind of territory. The couch was for the waking hours, for the time when we were both conscious of our proximity. And it was there that the ambiguity became most potent. We would fall into it after long days of classes and practice, our limbs heavy, our minds tired. We'd put on a movie, and the space between us on the worn cushions would shrink as the evening wore on. It started with a shoulder brushing against mine, then an arm resting along the back of the couch behind me. One evening, deep into a mindless action movie, he had simply laid his head on my shoulder. It was a heavy, trusting weight. I remember the scent of his shampoo, something clean and vaguely citrusy, and the feeling of his soft hair against my neck. I sat perfectly still, my entire focus narrowing to that single point of contact. My job was to be still, to be solid, to be a dependable structure for him to lean on. I treated it like a form of meditation, focusing on my breath, trying to calm the frantic symphony in my chest. He was just tired. He was just sad. This was what friends did. But then the gestures began to change, to evolve into something I couldn't so easily explain away. He started to initiate the closeness with a casual, almost thoughtless deliberation. He would lie down and rest his head in my lap while I read, his eyes closed, his breathing evening out into the rhythm of sleep. I would sit there for hours, a book open in my hands, not reading a single word, my fingers aching with the desire to run them through his hair. I never did. I just let him sleep, my body a living pillow, my own needs and desires sublimated entirely to his comfort. He would tuck his feet under my legs, seeking warmth. He would shift until his back was pressed firmly against my side. Each new point of contact was a test, a question I didn't know how to answer. Was this just Julian, who had always been more physically affectionate than me, leaning on his friend in a time of crisis? Or was it something more? The line between friendship and something else became a blurry, indistinct horizon, and I was adrift in the vast, uncertain ocean between them. He was the one who started calling me dramatic, always with a small, affectionate smile. It was because I would analyze the plot of a movie too deeply, or because I found complex emotional narratives in the simple photographs I took. You're always looking for the story underneath the story, Leo, he'd say, nudging me with his foot. It was a gentle ribbing, but it felt like a warning. It made me paranoid that he could see the frantic analysis happening inside my own head, that he knew I was treating every casual touch, every shared silence, as a clue to be deciphered, a piece of a puzzle I was desperately trying to solve. Was I inventing the story underneath our story? Was I projecting my own desperate hope onto his simple, platonic need for comfort? The fear that I was making everything dramatic, that I was seeing intention where there was only grief, was a constant, chilling companion. It kept me silent. It kept me still. It kept me from ever initiating the touch, from ever closing the final inch between us myself. I was the observer, the passive recipient of his ambiguous affection. It was the only safe role to play. If I was wrong, I could retreat back into the quiet shell of our friendship without having risked a thing. But if I was right, the thought was too bright, too terrifying to look at directly. And so we existed in this strange, undefined space for weeks that bled into a month, then two. We were roommates, bedfellows, confidants. We were two bodies orbiting each other in the small universe of my apartment, held in place by a gravitational pull whose source I didn't understand. The ritual of the couch became the centerpiece of our evenings. After dinner, after the quiet talk of the day had subsided, we would gravitate towards it. He would stretch out, and after a moment's hesitation, I would settle in beside him. Sometimes he would immediately shift to press against me. Other times, he would wait, and the tension would build in the quiet space until one of us, usually him, would move to erase it. It was a silent negotiation, a dance we both knew the steps to but had never named. And then came that Tuesday, the one with the rain and the cheap beer and the accusation. He called me dramatic, and the irony of it was a sharp, painful pang in my chest. I, who had been suppressing a drama of epic proportions for years, was being called out for my quiet intensity. And then I shifted, a simple, physical act. And he spoke the two words that burned away all the ambiguity, all the plausible deniability, all the safe, careful stories I had been telling myself. Don't move. His hand was a brand on my hip, his voice a raw nerve. In that moment, I knew. I was not making it up. The story underneath the story was real, and it was about to be told, whether I was ready for it or not. The silence that followed his whisper was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was absolute, a perfect vacuum that sucked all the air from my lungs and all the thought from my head. The flickering light from the television painted moving pictures on the walls, ghosts of a world outside that no longer seemed to matter. My entire universe had contracted to the 5 points of contact where his fingers pressed into the denim of my jeans. I could feel the distinct pressure of each one, a separate and searing brand. My heart, which had been hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, seemed to have stopped entirely, waiting for permission to beat again. I obeyed his command implicitly. I became a statue, every muscle locked, my entire being focused on the simple, impossible task of not moving, not breathing, not thinking. But of course I was thinking. My mind was a maelstrom, a chaotic swirl of fear and a hope so intense it was physically painful. This was the crossing. I knew it with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. For months, we had been walking along the edge of a cliff, pretending not to notice the dizzying drop just inches from our feet. We had maintained a careful, deliberate ignorance of the precipice. But his words, his touch, had been a sudden gust of wind, forcing us to look down, to acknowledge the danger and the possibility of the fall. His hand wasn't just resting on me. It was anchoring me, holding me in place for a reason. But what was the reason? Was he about to push me away, to finally define the boundary I had so feared? Or was he about to pull me closer, to leap into the terrifying, beautiful emptiness with me? The seconds stretched into eternity, each one a lifetime of anxious waiting. He shifted then, not away, but closer. It was a slow, deliberate movement, an inch-by-inch closing of the remaining distance between us. The length of his thigh pressed against mine, his chest against my shoulder. He brought his other hand up, placing it gently on my chest, right over my heart. I was sure he could feel the frantic, rabbit-quick thumping that had started up again, a desperate drumbeat signaling my terror and my yearning. His face was so close to mine now that I could feel the warmth of his breath on my cheek. His eyes, in the dim, shifting light, were dark and unreadable, deep pools of shadow and uncertainty. He was searching my face for something, an answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. My own eyes were locked on his, my entire silent, secret history laid bare in my gaze. I had no more walls, no more defenses. He had dismantled them with 2 words and a single touch. His gaze dropped to my lips. It was a fractional movement, a barely perceptible dip of his head, but it felt like a seismic event. The world tilted on its axis. This was it. This was the moment of impact. The air grew thick, heavy with anticipation. I could feel the fine tremor in the hand on my chest, a mirror of the trembling that was running through my own body. He was as scared as I was. That realization, more than anything else, gave me a strange sense of calm. This wasn't one-sided. This wasn't my manufactured drama. This was real, and it was happening to both of us. Leo, he whispered, my name a fragile, broken thing on his lips. It wasn't a statement, but a question, a plea for permission. And in that moment, I had a choice. I could pull back. I could make a joke, shatter the tension, and retreat to the safety of our friendship. I could pretend this never happened, and we could go back to the comfortable, painful ambiguity of before. I could save myself from the potential devastation of a mistake, of a misreading. The path of self-preservation was wide open, beckoning me back to the familiar, lonely territory I knew so well. Or I could stay. I could hold his gaze, remain still under his touch, and give him the silent permission he was asking for. I could choose to fall, to trust that he would fall with me. It was the greatest risk I had ever taken. I did not move. He took my stillness as the answer it was. He leaned in, closing the final, agonizing millimeter of space between us, and his lips met mine. It was not a passionate, cinematic kiss. It was hesitant, soft, and breathtakingly gentle. It was a question, a confession, and an apology all at once. It was the taste of beer and salt, and something that was just uniquely, inimitably Julian. It was tentative at first, a light pressure, a testing of the waters. And then, as I finally allowed myself to respond, to soften into the kiss, it deepened. His hand moved from my chest to the side of my neck, his thumb stroking softly against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. I brought my own hand up, my fingers tangling in the soft hair at the nape of his neck, a touch I had dreamed of for years. The world outside, the rain, the television, my tiny apartment, it all dissolved into nothingness. There was only the warmth of his mouth on mine, the steadying pressure of his hands, the quiet, overwhelming rightness of it. It felt like coming home to a place I had never been before. It was a silent, beautiful, terrifying truth finally being spoken. The aftermath was a landscape of profound and unnerving silence. When the kiss ended, we didn't spring apart. We remained entwined on the couch, the blue light of the television screen washing over us in silent, rhythmic waves. He rested his forehead against mine, his breathing ragged, a match to my own. I could feel the frantic beating of his heart through his chest, a wild rhythm that I felt echoed in every cell of my own body. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the enormity of what had just happened. A line had been crossed, a seal broken. We had stepped off the cliff, and now we were suspended in the terrifying, weightless freefall, with no idea where or how we would land. I wanted to say something, anything, to fill the deafening quiet, but I had no words. My entire vocabulary had been reduced to the feeling of his skin against mine, the lingering taste of him on my lips. After what felt like an eternity, he was the one who moved. He pulled back slowly, deliberately, disentangling himself from me. He didn't just move to the other end of the couch. He stood up, creating a chasm of empty space between us. He walked over to the window and stared out at the rain-streaked street, his back to me. His posture was rigid, his shoulders tight with a tension that hadn't been there moments before. The fragile, vulnerable connection we had shared was severed, and in its place was a cold, impenetrable wall. I remained on the couch, feeling suddenly exposed and chilled, the warmth of his body already a fading memory. I watched his reflection in the dark glass of the window, a ghostly, indistinct figure against the night. He was running a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew meant he was stressed, overwhelmed. "I should go," he said, his voice quiet and strained, directed at the window pane, not at me. The words were a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. Go? Go where? My apartment had been his home for months. The idea of him leaving now, after this, was incomprehensible. It felt like a rejection, a negation of the truth we had just uncovered together. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the warm, hazy afterglow of the kiss. I had been wrong. It was a mistake. I had made it all dramatic, just like he'd said, and now he was running from the wreckage I had created. "Julian," I started, my own voice sounding weak and unfamiliar. He turned from the window, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. His gaze was fixed on a point somewhere over my left shoulder. His face was a mask of confusion and something that looked terrifyingly like regret. I'm tired," he stammered, the excuse so flimsy it was insulting. "I think I just need to. I'm gonna go back to my dorm. Get some sleep." He was already moving toward the door, grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair where it had been a permanent fixture for 2 months. He was leaving. He was actually leaving. He paused with his hand on the doorknob, his back still to me. "I'll see you at practice tomorrow," he said, The words clipped and devoid of emotion. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the sudden, crushing emptiness of the apartment. I was left alone on the couch, the ghost of his touch still tingling on my skin, the silence he left behind a screaming accusation. I had ruined everything. The one thing I had feared above all else had come to pass. I had lost my best friend. The quiet, comfortable sanctuary of our friendship was in ruins, and I was sitting alone in the rubble, with no idea how to even begin to comprehend the devastation. That night, I slept in my bed alone for the first time in months. The empty space beside me was a cold, vast wilderness, and I had never felt so lost. The next few days were a masterclass in avoidance. At practice, Julian was a stranger. He arrived just before we got in the water and left the second we got out. He kept his headphones on, his gaze directed at the floor, at the water, anywhere but at me. The easy camaraderie, the shared jokes, the comfortable silences, they were all gone, replaced by a strained, formal politeness that was more painful than any argument could have been. He would nod a curt hey in my direction, and that was it. In the water, he pushed himself relentlessly, swimming lap after punishing lap, as if he were trying to outrun a demon. I watched him, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I felt like I was watching him through a thick pane of glass, so close but utterly unreachable. The rest of the team noticed the shift, of course. They threw confused glances between us, but no one dared to ask what was wrong. The chasm between us was a palpable thing, a zone of icy silence that no one wanted to enter. My apartment felt cavernous and empty without him. Every corner held a memory of him. The indent his head had left on the couch cushion, the mug he always used still sitting by the sink, the faint scent of his soap lingering in the bathroom. The silence was no longer a comfort. It was a heavy blanket, suffocating me. I spent my evenings staring at my phone, typing out and deleting a dozen different text messages. Are you okay? Can we talk? Did I imagine it? Each one felt both inadequate and far too demanding. I was drowning in the uncertainty. The kiss had felt so real, so mutual. His trembling hands, his whispered plea, they couldn't have been a lie. But his retreat, his coldness, told a different story. It told me that he regretted it, that it was a moment of grief-fueled confusion he now wanted to erase. The thought that I had been a stand-in, a convenient comfort he had mistaken for something more, was a bitter, corrosive acid in my gut. After a week of this agonizing limbo, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was destroying me more surely than any angry words could. I deserved an explanation. Whatever we had been, whatever we were now, it deserved more than to be snuffed out by a week of fearful avoidance. I needed to know the truth, even if it was the truth I feared most. I made a decision. I would not let him run away from this. I would not let him reduce what had happened between us to a shameful secret to be buried. I found him after practice, as he was stuffing his wet gear into his bag, clearly intending to make another quick escape. I stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "We need to talk," I said. My voice was quiet, but it held a firmness that surprised even me. It was the voice of someone with nothing left to lose. He froze, his hands still in his bag. He finally, reluctantly, lifted his eyes to meet mine. I saw a flicker of something in them. Fear, exhaustion, a deep, profound sadness. He looked cornered. "Leo, I can't," he said, his voice low, pleading. "No," I said, shaking my head. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to kiss me like that, and then just disappear. You don't get to pretend I don't exist." My voice started to shake, the dam of my carefully controlled emotions beginning to crack. Was it a mistake? Was it pity? Was I just convenient? Just tell me. Whatever it is, just be honest with me. I can take it. But this silence, Julian, this is killing me. He flinched as if I had struck him. He looked away, his jaw tight. He pulled his hands from his bag and stood up straight, a cornered animal preparing to fight or flee. He chose neither. He just seemed to deflate, the fight going out of him, leaving behind a raw, painful vulnerability. "It wasn't a mistake," he whispered, his voice so quiet I could barely hear him over the echoing drips in the empty locker room. He finally looked at me again, and his eyes were glistening. And it wasn't pity. God, Leo, no. It was, he trailed off, struggling for the words. He took a deep breath, a shuddering, unsteady thing. It was the first thing that's felt real in months. And that's what scares me. His confession hung in the air between us, as fragile and as powerful as the kiss itself. It wasn't the rejection I had braced myself for. It was something far more complicated, far more human. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was running from a feeling that didn't fit into the neat architecture of the life he had built, the identity he had always known. He had just lost a huge piece of that life, and now, in the rubble, he had found something he never expected, something that terrified him with its intensity and its implications. You have to understand, he continued, his voice gaining a desperate urgency. My whole world just fell apart. I feel like I don't know who I am anymore. And then you've been this constant, steady thing, this safe place. And I think I leaned on that too much. I crossed a line, and I panicked, because it felt too good, too right. And I don't trust anything that feels right now. I don't trust myself. He looked utterly lost, adrift in a sea of his own confusion. I hurt you, he said, his voice cracking. I saw it on your face, and I couldn't stand it. So I ran. It was cowardly. I'm sorry, Leo. I am so sorry. The anger and hurt that had been churning inside me for a week began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. I finally understood. This wasn't about me, not really. It was about his fear, his grief, his shattered sense of self. The kiss hadn't been the problem. It had been the catalyst that forced him to confront a truth he wasn't ready to face. I closed the small distance between us, and this time, he didn't pull away. I reached out, not to touch him, but just to hold my hand in the space between us, an offering. You didn't ruin anything, I said softly. And you're not alone in being scared. A single tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just stood there, looking at me, letting me see the full extent of his brokenness, his fear, and his fragile, terrifying hope. And in that moment of shared, honest vulnerability, in the sterile, chlorinated air of an empty locker room, we finally began to land. We didn't fix everything in that one conversation. There was no magical, cinematic moment where all the fear and confusion vanished, replaced by perfect clarity. Healing, I learned, is not a dramatic reveal. It's a slow, quiet process, like the patient development of a photograph in a darkroom. It requires time and gentleness and the courage to sit with the uncomfortable, blurry stages before the final image comes into focus. We left the locker room that day with a new, fragile understanding. We agreed to take a step back, not to the cold distance of the past week, but to a place of intentional friendship, a space where we could rebuild our foundation on the new, honest ground we had uncovered. We needed to rediscover our rhythm, to learn how to be friends again in the light of this new, acknowledged truth. He didn't move back into my apartment right away. He needed his own space, a place to untangle the mess of his own feelings without the constant, charged proximity of me. I understood. It hurt, the continued emptiness of my apartment, a constant reminder of our new distance, but I knew it was necessary. It was a space for him to breathe, to heal from his breakup, to figure out who he was without Sarah, and to begin to understand what he felt for me, untangled from his grief and need. We started with coffee. Simple, public, a neutral ground. We talked about classes, about practice, about everything and nothing. It was awkward at first, a stilted performance of our old friendship. We were both hyper-aware of the new knowledge that sat between us, a silent, sleeping giant in the middle of the coffee shop. But slowly, gradually, the stiffness began to ease. His real laugh, the loud, uninhibited one, made its first reappearance. I found myself relaxing, the knot of anxiety in my stomach slowly unclenching. We were finding our way back to each other, not by ignoring what had happened, but by carefully, respectfully walking around it for the time being. The real turning point came a few weeks later. I was working in the university darkroom, the red safe light casting a warm, monastic glow over everything. I loved the quiet solitude of this place, The alchemy of turning light and shadow into something permanent. I was so focused on coaxing an image from a sheet of photographic paper, watching a face emerge from the white emptiness, that I didn't hear him come in. He just suddenly appeared at my side, a dark, quiet shape in the red gloom. I jumped, startled, nearly dropping my tongs into the developer tray. "Sorry," he whispered, his voice a low rumble in the small, silent space. "Didn't mean to scare you. It's okay." I breathed, my heart still beating a little too fast. "What are you doing here?" "I just wanted to see what you do in here," he said. He watched as I moved the print from the developer to the stop bath, his curiosity genuine. I explained the process in quiet tones, showing him how the image bloomed into existence, how the chemicals worked to fix it, to make it last. He listened intently, his presence not an intrusion, but a quiet, respectful observance. He was entering my world, the quiet, internal space where I made sense of things, where I created. It felt more intimate than any touch had been. After the print was safely in the final wash, we stood in the quiet, red-lit room, the gentle sound of running water the only noise. "I miss you," he said, the words simple, direct, and utterly devastating in their honesty. He wasn't looking at me, but at my hands, still damp with chemicals. "I miss being at the apartment. I miss this. The quiet. It's too loud in my head when I'm alone in my room. I miss you too," I said, and the truth of it was a profound ache in my chest. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine in the dim light. There was a clarity in them I hadn't seen before, a quiet certainty that had replaced the storm of confusion. "Can I come over tonight?" he asked. "Just to watch a movie. On the couch. I promise. I just want to be near you." And so the ritual began again, but this time it was different. It was rebuilt on a foundation of honesty. When he came over that night, there was a new intentionality to our closeness. When we sat on the couch, the shrinking of the space between us wasn't accidental or ambiguous. It was a conscious choice. He settled next to me, and after a moment, I leaned my head against his shoulder. He responded by draping his arm around me, pulling me closer. It was a simple, profound gesture of acceptance. There was no tension, no frantic internal analysis on my part. There was just a quiet, peaceful sense of rightness. We were not just two friends huddling together for warmth. We were two people who had navigated a terrifying storm and found a safe harbor in each other. The door to my bedroom remained closed for a while. We spent our nights on the couch, often falling asleep in a tangle of limbs, waking up in the pale morning light with stiff necks and a renewed sense of gentle intimacy. The physical space of the bed still felt too loaded, too connected to the confusion and the pain of our past. The couch was our new beginning, a neutral territory we were reclaiming and redefining together. One night, as a movie ended and the credits rolled in silence, he turned to me, his expression serious. "I am in love with you, Leo," he said. The words were not whispered. They were spoken clearly, calmly, into the quiet space of the room, a statement of fact that he had examined from all angles and found to be true. I think I have been for a long time, in some way I didn't understand. The breakup, it didn't create this. It just cleared away the noise so I could finally hear it. I looked at him, at the beautiful, honest face of the man I had loved in silence for so long, and I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. The image in the darkroom was finally clear, sharp, and undeniable. My quiet, internal drama had found its voice, and it was his. "I know," I said, a small smile touching my lips. "I love you, too." There are moments that arrive disguised as endings, a breakup, a painful silence, a closed door. But sometimes, they are not endings at all. They are merely the clearing of a space, the demolition of an old, unstable structure to make way for something new, something stronger, something built on a foundation of truth. Our new beginning wasn't a grand, dramatic event. It was quiet and slow and built out of 1,000 small, intentional moments. It was the way he started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom again, a silent declaration of his intention to stay. It was the way he'd reach for my hand when we walked across campus, a simple, public acknowledgement of what we were to each other. It was the day he brought over a box of his things, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because my apartment had finally, truly, become his home, our home. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, a silence that was no longer empty, but full of a quiet, unwavering love. And the couch, once a stage for our anxiety and ambiguity, became simply a place of comfort, a place where we could rest, together, at the end of the day, with no space left between us at all.